Hello, I'm David Tutor again, and this is the fifth in a series of short lectures on conflict, security, stability, and development. This week we're going to look at the relationship between security and development, and I'm going to begin by reminding you that in an earlier lecture I talked about the difficulties of defining security. And I actually offered you at that stage a definition which was relatively short and simple, and which I hoped would be practical and suitable to work with. I'm going to put that definition up on the screen again now, and that, just to remind you, and that will act as a precursor, if you like, to what we're going on to discuss now, which is definitions of development, and whether indeed, and this is I think a very open question, whether in all the confusion of definitions of both security and development, it's actually possible to say anything worthwhile and useful about the relationship between the two. I will conclude by saying that yes, perhaps there is, but only if we stick to reasonably sensible and practical definitions of the two. Right, well, let's begin with a couple of organizations that are deeply concerned with development issues. One of them is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And on its website, it has not so much a definition of development as a kind of mission statement that says what its job is. And I'm going to put up extracts from that mission statement now on the screen, and ask you to have a look at it while I make a few comments. I think there's a couple of things that stand out about this mission statement. You'll see that to begin with, this is the OECD promoting things, promoting particularly ideas. Development is therefore conceived as something that the OECD, sometimes known as the Rich Countries Club, does to others, and indeed it has a development advisory committee to advise other nations fairly strongly about what they should do. And it says that if you follow our prescriptions, well, you will improve the economic and social well-being of your people. The second point is that it's an overtly ideological organization. Its mission statement talks about restoring confidence in markets and re-establishing healthy public finances, and goes on to talk about innovation, environment, emerging economies, and ensuring that people of all ages can develop the skills to work productively and satisfyingly in the jobs of tomorrow, should there be any. In other words, it's not a neutral objective organization. It's an objective which, it's an organization which sees development through a very clear and very narrow ideological prism. It's fair to add also that its method of working, rather like that of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and even the European Union to some extent, is very much a top-down, elite-governed method of development. And it's not surprising that this concept of development has led to a certain amount of dissent from certain quarters, and that other people have tried to produce different development definitions or different development concepts. Now, one of those organizations, another four-letter acronym, is the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. UNDP, you may remember, were the people who brought you human security, and unsurprisingly, they have also brought you human development. Now, the definition of human development on their website is really more like a miniature essay than a definition. So I'm going to put up on the screen now and talk briefly about a few selected extracts from this definition, which you'll see is completely different in its thinking to the thinking that lies behind the OECD mission statement. You see, it's about giving people freedom and opportunities, developing abilities, healthy and creative life, knowledgeable, access to resources needed for a decent standard of living, environmental sustainability, equality between men and women, create an environment for people to develop their full potential and have a reasonable chance of leading lives that they value. Fine. Much of that, I think, would be uncontroversial in pretty much any environment. But there's a couple of points that are worth bearing in mind as we look at that definition. Firstly, it's what I would describe as teleological. It shares with the OECD's thinking a certain concept which is called the blank slate. The blank slate approach, or the blank slate concept, essentially argues that there has been no development, or at least there wasn't until the beginning of modern development theory in the late 1940s. And there are therefore nothing more than a series of initiatives which by and large the developed world does to the undeveloped world, and the undeveloped world goes along with. That's particularly interesting in the sense that the issues that UNDP are addressing here are essentially software type issues. They're not issues of growth and infrastructure development and that kind of thing. They are essentially subjective and, as I say, software rather than hardware issues. And the assumption in this text is that, put crudely, people have not had happy and satisfying lives before in history, and they don't have them now, and that they will only have them if they agree to implement various UNDP proposed or approved projects. Now, it's obviously very difficult to argue that that is literally true. Indeed, one of the things that we find is that development as a process understood by major international institutions has a habit of making people less happy and less content with their lives than was the case before. So it's rather odd to suggest that, that development is going to provide a community with happiness for the first time, perhaps by uprooting them from their traditional culture and sending them to live in the slums of cities. But then again, these definitions are frankly so vague that it is almost impossible to be sure what they do mean. And that really is my second point, that development definitions like the UNDP one are essentially useless for any form of planning. They're nice aspirations, but that's about it. And as a result, it's not possible to turn any of these aspirations, however nice they may be, into concrete activities and initiatives. Or rather, you can have concrete concrete activities and initiatives, but there's no obvious link conceptually or otherwise between those activities and these very high-level political objectives. It's worth adding also that in its own way, this kind of definition is as authoritarian and absolutist as definitions of development and practices of development by some of the 3- and 4-letter international economic institutions. It says basically, we're coming to remodel your society. For example, there will be something that we define as equality between men and women, and you'd better like it. Ignoring perhaps the fact, to come back to the main subject of this lecture, that sudden and violent changes in society are almost always a recipe for conflict of some kind or another. Now, against that background, you have to ask yourself, even if you accept the sort of definition of security that I have put forward, a straightforward and simple one, is it possible to make any sensible judgments about the relationship between security, however defined, and development, however defined? Well, 2 points, I think. One is that we need to distinguish between actual relationships between these two concepts and political statements about relations between these two concepts. One way of getting out of this problem, bearing in mind that there are no agreed definitions for either term, is to produce a political formulation which effectively says both are important and all can have prizes. This is particularly associated with a speech by Kofi Anan when he was Secretary General of the United Nations, where he said things like, there is no development without security and no security without development. I don't know whether Anan or probably his speechwriter actually believed this. I hope he didn't. But it's not really important whether he believed it or not, because this is not a piece of operational guidance. It is simply a political consensus statement intended to pacify both sides of the debate, because both the development and the security communities are large, voluble, powerful, and well-funded. And in a discussion about the relationship between the two of them, they will only be satisfied if they are described as being at least equal in importance to the other. So, in other words, these sorts of consensus statements, which we find in different texts here and there, should not be taken too seriously as attempts to explain the real world, attempts to bridge a political gap between powerful forces. Things become slightly easier, in my opinion, if we have a simple definition of development, and one which is pragmatically based. In other words, rather than describing some teleological situation that doesn't exist, and if it did exist, couldn't be measured, why don't we talk about what development has actually been, and then at that point we may be able to decide whether security has had anything to do with it. I'm going to put on the screen now my own modest contribution to this discussion, a short definition of development, which I will talk about for a moment. Now, you will see that this is a very different kind of definition, and I'm talking about an increase in the formal complexity of organizations, political and economic structures, and so forth. Formal complexity. Because as we have seen, and as has been written about exhaustively, so-called primitive social structures can often be enormously complex and sophisticated. And one of the ironies is that development experts often arrive from less sophisticated societies and make the societies in which they work in turn also less sophisticated and less complex than they used to be. So when I talk about complexity, I do mean the kind of complexity that you see as opposed to the complexity you don't see. And of course, in such circumstances, it's not impossible that the people who are being developed may, actually come to feel that they're losing a great deal of the complexity and the subtlety of the societies that they value. It's worth reminding ourselves of what cultural anthropologists have said about the complexities of so-called primitive societies. They are, in many cases, infinitely more complex than our modern societies are. If you read, for example, Clifford Geertz on Bali, you have a description of a society which is complex to an almost hallucinatory degree. Now, if we think in terms of complexity, this gets over one of the problems, at least, of the application of development theory, and makes it easier to discuss the relationship of security. Because the one thing that everybody is clear about is that the effects of various initiatives from the OECD, from UNDP, and from a whole collection of other acronyms have generally been limited to non-existent in terms of actually benefiting the countries in which these organizations work. And you can read about this in books like that of Hadron Chang or William Easterley, coming from rather different positions, but saying in the end much the same thing. The traditional definitions of development, various as they may be, share one common factor, which is that attempts to move in the direction of those definitions and by those sorts of understandings and methods have failed, which is something of a disadvantage. Now, if you take complexity, second point, as essentially being what development is all about, or at least formal complexity, we can relate development to what has actually happened in history as societies have become formally more complex. And we can, I think, make common sense judgments about societies in the world today that are more complex or less complex. If you, I don't know, spend a weekend in Singapore, followed by a weekend in, let's say, New York, you're going to conclude, 99% of the time, I should think, that Singapore is a much more developed country than the United States. You won't necessarily be able to write an essay on development theory, but it will be obvious to you that that is indeed the case. And the advantage of taking a common sense definition of development, like the one that I mentioned, is that it enables us to integrate into the security and development argument actual cases of real countries that have undergone development in history and the importance of security for that development. Because one of the strange things about this whole debate is that development is not something exotic that only began after the Second World War. Just about all societies have developed over a period of time. Some, it is true, have undeveloped afterwards, Rome being a case in point. But in most cases, even societies, even countries which are considered to be hopelessly static have in fact undergone development, even if it wasn't very obvious. An extreme case would be Tokugawa Japan, for example, which was theoretically a totally stable society, hidden away from the rest of the world for 250 years. But historians have found, in fact, that there were quite significant technological developments, nonetheless, that took place during that time. There probably isn't a society in the course of the whole of human history that hasn't developed naturally, until oddly today, when it turns out that development, which used to be something relatively easy and almost automatic, has now become very difficult, in spite of the fantastic amount of money and brain power which is devoted to it. What is clear is that the complexity of social and economic structures, if you take that to be a characteristic of development, can only be delivered by the state and can only be delivered under circumstances of security. The relationship between security and development is therefore, in principle, a very simple one. Security creates the preconditions for development to take place. It doesn't mean that development will take place automatically. It's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient one. But without security, there simply is no possibility that development will take place. And this seems to be a universal rule that applies everywhere throughout history. But that's actually not the end of the argument. The argument is a little bit more complex than that, because if security creates development, development can also create insecurity. Yes, I did say insecurity, not security. And I'd like to finish by mentioning four characteristics of development in terms of the complexity of societies anyway, which can cause security problems, because this is something which is often overlooked. The first and most obvious result of development is changes in the nature of society and the nature of the economy, and bringing new political and economic actors into play. New political and economic actors, or newly powerful ones, have a habit of wanting power and influence, which at that stage is in the hands of others. This virtually always produces conflict. Sometimes, as in the case of England, this conflict is relatively small scale, but it runs the gamut through large-scale civil unrest up to civil war, if not multiple civil wars. So that's the first effect of development. It creates new forces and creates the potential for political conflict. Secondly, more mundanely, development changes social structures, and most obviously it causes people from the countryside to move to the towns and cities. As we discussed in an earlier lecture, this isn't always a voluntary process. They sometimes need to be forced to do so. But one of the mundane facts about living in towns and cities, for example, is that insecurity and crime are always higher than in traditional communities. So the very process of development creates insecurity for people. A third, slightly unexpected result, but I think it's an important one of development, is the creation of ideology. Traditional societies don't have ideologies in the sense that we understand the term. They essentially carry on doing what they've always done according to rules that they've always used and rules that they change pragmatically when they need to do so. Once people become unmoored from these traditional assumptions, which are seldom written down or codified, they nonetheless want some kind of guidance on how to live their lives and what to do. Thus, you find the development of ideologies, you find the development of mass religion, but also of different forms of political, national, and social ideology. And it is the nature of ideologies to come into conflict with each other, and particularly when you include literacy and a much larger urban population, you have the basis for ideological conflict and insecurity as well. And finally, development, whilst it may be seen as a good thing, and indeed probably is a good thing for the vast majority of the population, isn't good for everyone. And what we have observed in a number of countries, Africa particularly, but also elsewhere, is that development can be a threat. It can be a threat particularly to patrimonial power structures that run effectively of rent seeking, because development actually leads to the creation of economic and social forces over which you have no control. The classic thing is the development of an urban middle class with its own sources of revenue, for example. So there are many societies in the world where development is seen as a threat and where political forces in power use every means at their disposal to try to prevent it happening. So we've seen that it is possible to make some, albeit limited, judgments about the relative relationship between security and development, that it's not all one way, it's not easy. Lest I should be thought to be anti-development, I'm not, and anyway, being against development is largely like being against bad weather or standing in front of a bus. Development just happens. It's important, though, that we recognize, firstly, that security is an absolute precondition for it, although it doesn't guarantee it, and secondly, that development itself can and does lead to many security problems. Thank you.